Hi again, this is Sean from Gnostic Psych, where I share with you the arcane and interesting from the annals of psychology. If you like this video, please click to subscribe. If you've never heard of Solomon Carter Fuller, you probably should have. The psychology field has been largely dominated by credit being paid to males of white European descent throughout its history. However, there are many female figures who have contributed to the psychology body of research as well as psychologists of color. And one of these psychologists of color was actually the country's first black psychiatrist, Solomon Carter Fuller. He is credited more often as a psychiatrist than a psychologist, since, an exception to Freud's psychoanalysis, both involve the study of the nervous system, especially the brain. Fuller should be credited as the father of the U.S.'s Alzheimer's research, since he brought the study of dementia stateside from the University of Munich, where he studied under the disease's namesake, alloy Alzheimer. Just to give you a little bit of a history, Fuller was actually born in Monrovia, Liberia in 1872. His parents, John Lewis Fuller and Anna Ursula James, had been slaves in Virginia. John had bought their freedom, and they lived in Norfolk, Virginia, before immigrating to Liberia in 1852. They had belonged to the American Colonization Society, which was an organization of freed slaves who sought migration and settlement in Africa. The American Colonization Society was organized to establish a colony run by the freed, repatriated slaves in West Africa, which eventually became the nation of Liberia. The Fullers became a part of the Liberian ruling class, who were known as Americo-Liberians. John Lewis Fuller was a coffee planter and official in the government, and Anna Ursula Fuller was a teacher who set up her own school in Monrovia. Young Solomon was influenced by his mother's family's involvement in the medical field, which ultimately led him to want to be a medical doctor himself. Upon completion of a preparatory school degree, equivalent of what the high school diploma is today, Solomon moved to Salisbury, North Carolina in 1889 and studied medicine at nearby Livingstone College. He graduated in 1893 and continued his studies at the Boston University School of Medicine. Boston University was accepting minority and female students at the time, which was way ahead of the time, and should be given credit for that. Solomon graduated in 1897 with a degree in medicine. His specialty focused on the brain and the newly emerging branch of neurophysiology called psychiatry. The place to go at the time in order to get a quality education of the mind was Central Europe, in particular Vienna, where Freud hailed from, Prague, and both these cities were still a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was still intact at the time, or in Germany, in particular Munich. Solomon was invited along with 4 other doctors of the mind to study under German psychiatrists Emil Kaplan and Alois Alzheimer at the University of Munich. If you recall from my previous video that I made on the medical origins of psychology, Emil Kaplan is credited with naming common mental disorders. He coined the term manic depression, which was used for decades to describe the mood disorder that's more recently been changed to bipolar, and his name for the psychotic disorder, most popularly called schizophrenia, was actually called dementia praecox. While studying dementias under Alois Alzheimer's, a professor under the supervision of Kaplan, Fuller was caught up in the politics of the latter's ambitions to stake his preeminence in the field. Kaplan had been in a sort of race with other leading psychiatrists of the day in taking credit for discovering and naming mental diseases and disorders. In 1910, Alzheimer, Fuller, and their colleagues were surprised to discover that Kaplan had renamed dementia senilis, which is Latin for senile dementia, which they had been studying, into 2 types based on stages. I'm sorry, everybody, that's my cat. Want to be a part of the video. But basically, dementia senilis was reclassified with 2 subcategories of dementia. You had the senile stage, which remained called dementia senilis, and the pre-senile version, which was called morbus Alzheimer. Morbus Alzheimer had been first discovered by a Hungarian psychiatrist in 1892 and was referred to since 1907 as Fischer's plaques, after the psychiatrist of the same name. Fischer happened to be a colleague of Kaplan's chief competitor, Arnold Pick. All these guys were psychiatrists. Fuller, like his mentor Alzheimer, had his doubts that there was enough scientific evidence to specify morbus Alzheimer as its own type of dementia. Morbus Alzheimer had only been based off of one case, interestingly. In 1906, a dementia patient named August D. had died. Her autopsy results indicated that her brain psychopathology had been different than others Alzheimer had studied. She had mixed neurological and psychiatric symptoms. Based on Fuller's research with brain tissue from autopsies, out of 92 brains that he had studied, only one met the criteria of traits for morbus Alzheimer that had been set aside by Kaplan. He wrote down his findings in the 1912 paper he wrote, Alzheimer's Disease, Senium Praecox, the Report of a Case in Review of Published Cases. In his paper, Fuller pointed out that the variations in dementia symptomatology, coupled with too few cases of dementias that met the criteria of morbus Alzheimer, had caused there to be a need for further research in order to distinguish the condition as its own type of dementia. In his 1912 follow-up paper, further observations on Alzheimer's disease, he described how his Alzheimer's case was different physiologically than the previous one that had basically been Alzheimer's one. That basically, besides the shared classification criteria, there was stark physiological differences between Alzheimer's case, August D., and his own case. And he wrote, a lack of basket-like appearance of many ganglion cells, neither large nor numerous ganglion cells, differences in plaques, and differences in the mode of onset and clinical course of the mental problem. By the time Fuller was disputing the existence of Alzheimer's as its own specific dementia, he had moved back to the U.S. and was practicing at the Westboro State Mental Hospital in Westboro, Massachusetts. He was also updating the autopsy practices at Clark University in it's spelled Worcester, Massachusetts, but I think it's pronounced Worcester, after a biologist named Hodge had invited him to give a lecture on psychiatry. Now, Clark University had become a hub of psychology research at the time in the U.S. It was really the place to study. However, they were still doing autopsies with animals, basically, in order to understand the human brain. That's how behind the times they were. More or less, he was able to update the practices, including using human cadavers. In 1909, Fuller had been invited to speak at a psychology conference held at Clark University for the college's 20th anniversary. Also invited and who attended were Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, child psychologist from the U.S., G. Stanley Hall, psychologist and philosopher William James, and the eventually famous nuclear physicist Ernest Rutherford. Fuller worked at Westboro State Hospital until 1919. He subsequently began to teach at his alma mater, Boston University School of Medicine. In 1923, a hospital for Black World War I veterans, the Tuskegee Veterans Administration, opened in Tuskegee, Alabama. Fuller recruited and trained black psychiatrists for the new hospital. In 1933, Fuller stepped down from teaching at Boston University to go into private practice until he died 20 years later in 1953. Fuller's contributions to the field of psychiatry and psychology were so prolific that after his death, a community mental health center was established through Boston University called the Dr. Solomon Carter Fuller Mental Health Center. In the 1970s, he was even, in his honor, given lecture named after him at the American Psychiatric Association's annual meetings.